Hi, I'm Chuck Olinik. I'm a Ukrainian American who was baptized with the name Yaroslav, and that happens to be the name I use in my historical reenactment group, the Society for Creative Anachronism. That's kind of a long introduction, I realize that, but it's kind of necessary to give you some of the backstory about what you're going to be seeing in this series of videos, which is an exploration of Slavic mythology. I've had an interest in the mythology and the folklore for most of my life, primarily because of my heritage. I grew up speaking Ukrainian in the house, and I learned when I was dragged kicking and screaming to church that I was to answer to Yaroslav there as my baptismal name. My parents never let me forget that I am a link in a chain going back to a culture that was suppressed for a long time. When I looked for Ukrainian history in books as a tween, I always ran into difficulties because this was the height of the Cold War and I couldn't really find much stuff on our people. And I asked my dad about that, and he told me that not everyone's history gets written, and it was up to me to find it. So there were political reasons and ethnic reasons why some of the history was really hard to find, and I had to play history detective because a lot of the history is mixed in with Polish stuff or Russian stuff and Soviet stuff, and it was a chore to find the details. Well, that was a lot of food for thought to dump on a tween, who spoke Ukrainian in the home and English at school. But my dad fired up my imagination with tales of the old country. He talked about the hardships, but there are also magical moments, like when he was in the forest as a very young child and he brought home what he thought was a puppy, and my grandfather made him take the wolf pup back to the woods. Or when my dad was in the service and he was on a troop train in Siberia and he looked out from the train and he saw a Siberian tiger running across the snow. And this really fired my imagination to try to understand my heritage. And where the mythology part came in, I started digging and I found out a lot of that was suppressed too, but not so much because of ethnicity. And the first thing you got to understand is all the different language groups that are part of the Slavic language family. Okay, first things first. The Slavs are divided up into three groups because nothing's ever going to come easy here. Eastern Slavs, if we're dividing them by language, are going to be Russians. They like to think of themselves as the Great Russians. Belarusians, or White Russians. Ukrainians. Except there's also dialects and divisions, and there's some disputes about what actually makes up an ethnic group that's different. Throw in something called Podlakian, which was a micro language in a part of Poland that's either a Belarusian dialect with Ukrainian traits or a Ukrainian dialect with Belarusian traits. There's also West Polesian, and that's another thing that could be a separate microlanguage. It could be a dialect of Belarusian. It could be might be a dialect of Ukrainian. Okay, then the Western Slavs get divided up, and one of those groups is the Czech-Slovak subgroup, which has Czechs and Slovaks. Okay. Then there's the Lakitic subgroup, and that's mostly Polish, Silesian, which can be considered a dialect of Polish. There was Polabian, and that was spoken in the Elbe River region until the rise of Prussia. Pomeranian, Kashubian, which could have been like a dialect of Pomeranian, could have been a dialect of Polish. There was the Sorbian subgroup, and they were sometimes referred to in Western European chronicles as Wendish. And then the Southern Slavs get divided into Eastern Southern Slavs and Western Southern Slavs. The Eastern branch has Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Old Church Slavonic. The Western branch has Serbo-Croatian, and then you have Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin. Oh, and there's also Slovene. So some linguists also think there might have been a northern Slavic branch, and that would have been spoken around Old Novgorod. So when you start dealing with all of these different languages and dialects, there's words that are similar, and I know, like, just from being able to deal with Ukrainian, once I kind of get the alphabet down, I can sort of squint at words in these other languages. I think I got it. For instance, you take a look at the names of the gods. Okay, I'll use an example. Perun, it's the god of thunder with the Eastern Slavs. Well, he could be Perun in Poland. He could be Perkunas or Purkins in either Latvia or Lithuania. And some of these gods, and with these different names, they're so similar, they might have different traits or different descriptions. So it gets pretty confusing. You may have noticed there were certain areas in Eastern Europe that I haven't talked about. Well, their languages are different, the cultures are different, but I'm going to find ways to squeeze their mythology and their folklore into this series. Romania, despite the mythology that the former Soviet Union tried to spread, it's not a Slavic country. You know, it's got a Romance language. But I want to get into some of their folklore. And as far as Hungary, well, the Magyars brought their own mythology, their own folklore, and I want to explore that. The same thing with the Finns and Estonians, since their languages are related and also happen to be related to Magyar. I also want to get into the Baltic countries of Lithuania and Latvia and bring in their mythology. Some of the confusion is going to come from monks writing down different accounts and maybe injecting their own bias into it. And that's a good place to start. So why don't we take a look at, okay, the Slavs were considered polytheistic, all right? Bunch of different gods and goddesses. And Prince Volodymyr, or Vladimir, who was Grand Prince at Kiev, he ends up becoming a Christian. But there's the story that is the one that's out there for popular consumption. Then there's one where you kind of have to dig a bit. And the first story is Volodymyr is deciding which way he wants to go because he wants to pick a new religion for his people. Never mind that he already has a temple on Starokivska Hill, which is dedicated to a number of gods and a goddess. Now, he's going to pick a faith for his people, and he has emissaries brought to him who are offering Judaism as a choice, and Islam as a choice, and Christianity as a choice. And the story goes that he found out that, well, if you're going to be Jewish, you're not going to be eating pork. It's like, oh, that's not acceptable. We we really like pork. We raise pigs. And that he found out that with Islam, you weren't supposed to drink, and there was a big uproar about that. Said, "Oh, my people really like to drink, so that's out." And Christianity was the one that was settled on. Okay, cool story, bro. But there's something that's a little closer to reality, and that was Volodymyr wants to marry the sister of the emperor in Constantinople. And this is a big deal. This is a great political connection. Constantinople, which also happens to be the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the emperor's sister is like, I'm not marrying a pagan. So Volodymyr converts. And he is baptized. And then what he ends up doing is, according to the story, he chases his people, herds them all into the Dnipro River. They get one mass baptism. Okay, boom, you're all Christians now. Oh, wait, we've got these pagan idols that are up on the hill. And there was this temple that had these idols there, and they were dedicated to Perun, who is the god of thunder and war and justice, and he was a god that was really favored by members of the prince's druzhina, his military retinue. And there was Trebog, and there was Dajbog, and there was Mokosh, the goddess, and Horus, and Simarhil. And he orders that the idols be taken down and they be beaten with rods to show how they have been cast aside, and then they get dumped in the mighty Dnipro River. A little sidebar. There's a Ukrainian proverb that says the wooden god dries out, which kind of hints at paganism's return. Okay, but, in this pantheon, that's a short version. It doesn't include one of the most recognizable figures in Slavic lore, Chernobog, the god of darkness, he is the dark god or the black god. And if you've seen Disney's Fantasia, and I'm assuming you have, otherwise you are living under a rock, it's the scene is played out to, there's like 11 minutes of it. I watched it this morning again to remind myself just how creepy it was. To the music of Mussorgsky, Night on Bald Mountain. It originally came from a story written by the Ukrainian writer Nikolai Gogol, who also wrote Taras Bulba. Another very pro-Ukrainian thing. And it's basically about the witches going to the Bald Mountain, and they have their party all night. Yay. Well, then Disney makes it a lot creepier with Chernobog rising up, and he summons the souls of people who were hanged on the gallows, or there were soldiers whose bodies were dumped in the moat of this one village, and there's various bodies of people coming up from unconsecrated ground, and they dance wildly, and and a church bell rings, and Chernobog kind of thinks about this and says, okay, party's over, guys, and the spirits drift back. Well, okay, interesting figure, and it's like, Slavic folklore. I thought about that guy, rising up from the mountain and the bat wings and all that stuff and the really scary eyes. And then you begin to realize that he wasn't really mentioned in any accounts anywhere until a 12th century monk in the Elbe River area wrote about him. And then suddenly there was also a Byelobog, the white god. And so now you have this Slavic dualism going on. And it's really kind of a shame because I think these are two like really interesting parts of folklore, but when you realize that the origins are like 12th century, it's like, oh, okay. So what we're going to do is in the next segment, we're going to take a look at those main six gods, and then we're going to start branching out from there. Well, I hope you stick with me.